In the spring of 1350, the largest city in North America went silent, not gradually, not over decades of slow decline. In 72 hours, 40,000 people vanished from a metropolis that had stood for centuries. They left behind 120 earthen mounds, some as tall as 10-story buildings. They left behind copper workshops still filled with tools. They left behind homes with food still in storage pits. They left behind an infrastructure more sophisticated than most European cities of the same era. And they left behind absolutely no explanation for where they went or why they left so quickly. This is Cahokia. You have probably never heard of it. That is not an accident. The city sat where East St. Louis, Illinois stands today, just across the Mississippi River from modern St. Louis. At its peak around 1100 CE, Cahokia was home to more people than London. It covered 6 square miles. Its central plaza could hold tens of thousands of people for ceremonies we still do not understand. The main pyramid, Monk's Mound, contains 22 million cubic feet of earth, more than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Workers moved all of that soil
Cahokia
in woven
was a
baskets.
thriving metropolis.
No wheels,
But
no
then,
horses,
mysteriously,
just human labor
it was
organized on a scale that should not have been possible for a society we were told had no writing system, no centralized government, no advanced technology. But here is what makes Cahokia different from every other story of civilizational collapse you have been told. The Maya took centuries to decline. Rome took generations to fall. The civilizations we are about to explore had hours, maybe days. Certainly not the slow, romantic fade into obscurity that makes for comfortable history textbooks. When archaeologists excavated Cahokia in the 1960s and 70s, they found something disturbing. No mass graves, no evidence of warfare, no burned buildings,
The Palace
no
of
plague
Knossos,
pits. The
a
people did
marvel
not
of the
die
Bronze
there.
Age,
They simply
bustling
left
with priests,
quickly,
merchants,
so
and
quickly that they
artisans.
abandoned items of value, so quickly that construction projects stopped mid-build. One of the most powerful urban centers in the pre-Columbian world emptied out faster than a modern city evacuates before a hurricane. Except there was no hurricane, no invading army, no drought. The climate records show normal conditions. The archaeological record shows a functioning society one moment and complete abandonment the next. What could make 40,000 people leave their homes in 3 days? Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Drop your location in the comments. I am genuinely curious how far this story has traveled and how many of you are hearing about these vanished civilizations for the first time, because that is part of what makes this so strange. These are not minor historical footnotes. These are some of the largest, most advanced societies in human history. And yet most of us graduate from school having never heard their names. The official explanation for Cahokia is usually something vague about resource depletion or political fragmentation, but that does not explain the speed. That does not explain why a society that had thrived for 300 years would disintegrate in less than a week. And it certainly does not explain why this pattern repeats across history, across continents, across completely unconnected cultures. Because Cahokia is not unique. It is not even the most dramatic example. Over the next hour and a half, we are going to look at 5 civilizations that disappeared so quickly it defies everything we think we know about how societies collapse. We are talking about millions of people. We are talking about empires that rivaled Rome. We are talking about cities with technology that would not be matched for thousands of years. And we are talking about evidence that mainstream archaeology has, quite frankly, worked very hard to ignore. The Indus Valley Civilization. 5 million people across 1,500 cities. Gone in 20 years. Their written language still undeciphered, possibly on purpose. The Minoans. The most advanced culture in Bronze Age Europe. Erased by a tsunami and volcanic eruptions so massive it probably inspired the Atlantis legend. Except this Atlantis was real, and the timeline matches almost perfectly. The ancestral Puebloans of Chaco Canyon. Builders of astronomical observatories and perfectly straight roads stretching hundreds of miles across the desert, vanished after a mega drought, but not before leaving behind archaeological evidence of something so dark that researchers rarely discuss it publicly: the Aksumite Empire. Africa's forgotten superpower that minted its own coins, traded with China and Rome, and built obelisks that still stand today. Disappeared so completely that most people do not even know it existed. And the Mycenaeans, whose collapse triggered what historians call the Bronze Age apocalypse, an event so catastrophic that literacy itself disappeared from entire regions for 300 years. An event caused, according to ancient records, by mysterious invaders called the Sea Peoples, who came from nowhere, destroyed everything, and then vanished back into historical obscurity. 5 civilizations, 5 rapid collapses. And when you line them up, when you look at the patterns, something emerges that should make us very uncomfortable about our own moment in history. Because the thing about overnight collapse is that it never looks like overnight collapse until it is already happening. The people of Cahokia probably thought their city was eternal. The Minoans certainly believed they would endure. Every one of these societies had citizens who went to bed thinking tomorrow would be just like today. They were wrong. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like conspiracy theory territory. Lost civilizations, suppressed evidence, hidden patterns. But here is the thing. We are not going to invent anything. We are not going to claim ancient aliens or impossible technology. Every single thing we discuss will be grounded in actual archaeological evidence, published scientific studies, and documented historical records. What we are going to do is ask why some of that evidence gets ignored, why certain patterns get dismissed, why the story of sudden, catastrophic collapse makes so many academics uncomfortable, and why the civilizations that vanish the fastest often seem to be the ones we know the least about. Hey, speaking of knowing more about hidden histories, if you are finding this interesting, do me a favor and subscribe to Tales Before Tesla. We dig into exactly these kinds of stories, the ones that do not make it into standard textbooks, the histories that raise more questions than they answer. Hit that bell icon too, because we have got a lot more of these deep dives coming. And trust me, the next few are going to get even stranger. Alright, let us get back to it. So, let us start with the biggest one. The civilization that most people have never heard of, despite the fact that it was larger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. A civilization so advanced that its cities had running water and sewage systems 2,000 years before Rome. A civilization whose writing system remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in archaeology. We are going to the Indus Valley. And when you see what happened there, when you see how quickly 5 million people disappeared, Cahokia is going to start looking like a minor event. 2600 BCE. The Indus Valley, spanning what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, is home to the largest urban civilization on Earth. We are not talking about a few scattered villages. We are talking about 1,500 cities and settlements spread across an area larger than Western Europe. We are talking about 5 million people living in planned urban centers with standardized brick sizes, grid-patterned streets, and covered drainage systems that would not be matched in sophistication until Victorian London, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi. These cities were not primitive. When the first archaeologists excavated Mohenjo-Daro in the 1920s, they found multi-story buildings with indoor plumbing. They found public baths the size of Olympic swimming pools. They found weights and measures so standardized that a brick made in one city would fit perfectly into a wall in another city 300 miles away. They found evidence of urban planning that would make a modern city engineer jealous. And then, around 1900 BCE, all of it stopped. Not slowly, not gradually. Within a single generation, maybe two, the entire Indus Valley civilization collapsed. Cities that had thrived for 700 years were abandoned. Trade networks that stretched to Mesopotamia and Central Asia dissolved. A writing system used across hundreds of sites simply ceased to exist. 5 million people either died or scattered so completely that they left almost no trace in the archaeological record. Here is what makes this collapse so unsettling. There is no evidence of invasion. None. No burned buildings. No mass graves filled with bodies showing signs of violence. No sudden appearance of a new culture with different pottery styles or burial practices. The cities were not destroyed. They were abandoned. Carefully, almost methodically. In Mohenjo-Daro, archaeologists found skeletons, but not the kind you would expect from a plague or a massacre. They found scattered human remains in the upper levels of the city. people who seem to have died where they fell, but not all at once. More like a slow trickle of deaths as the last inhabitants refused to leave, even as everyone else had already gone. Some of the skeletons show signs of violence, but not organized violence, more like desperate final conflicts among the stragglers. The standard explanation you will find in most textbooks is climate change, specifically, the drying up of the Saraswati River. And this is where things get interesting, because the Saraswati River is not supposed to exist. For centuries, the Saraswati was considered a mythological river, mentioned in ancient Hindu texts like the Rig Veda but with no physical evidence. Scholars dismissed it as religious fantasy. Then, in 2012, satellite imagery and geological surveys confirmed that a massive river system once flowed through the region where the Vedic text said it should be. The Saraswati was real. It was huge, and it dried up almost exactly when the Indus Valley civilization collapsed. So, case closed, right? The river dried up, the civilization fell. Except that does not explain the speed. Rivers do not disappear overnight. The drying of the Saraswati would have been a process taking decades, maybe a century. People would have adapted, they would have moved, they would have dug wells, they would have done what every other river valley civilization did when water sources shifted. But the Indus people did not adapt. They vanished. And here is where we need to talk about what they left behind. Or, more accurately, what they did not leave behind that they should have. Every major civilization develops writing, and usually, when we find ancient writing, we can eventually decipher it. We cracked Egyptian hieroglyphics. We decoded Mesopotamian cuneiform. We figured out Mayan glyphs. We even managed to read Linear B, the script of Bronze Age Greece. But Indus script? After a century of trying, we still cannot read it. There are over 400 distinct symbols in Indus script. They appear on thousands of seals, pottery, and tablets. The symbols are clearly systematic. They follow patterns. They repeat in ways that suggest grammar and syntax. But no one can figure out what language they represent. No one can decode what they say. Now, here's the conspiracy angle, and I want to be clear about something. This is not baseless speculation. This is a documented political issue. The Indian government has, on multiple occasions, restricted archaeological excavations at Indus Valley sites. Why? Because the findings threaten certain nationalist narratives about the origins of Hindu civilization. If the Indus people spoke a language unrelated to Sanskrit, if they were not the direct ancestors of modern Hindu culture, it complicates some very deeply held beliefs about Indian identity and history. There are scholars who believe the script has been partially decoded but that the findings are being suppressed. There are others who think the script might not be a complete writing system at all, but rather a series of symbols for trade and identification. And there are a few who suggest something darker, that the Indus script was deliberately destroyed or hidden by whoever came after, as a way of erasing the civilization from history. Think about that for a second. A writing system used by millions of people across hundreds of cities for 700 years, and we cannot read a single sentence. Either we are missing something fundamental about how the script works, or someone went to great lengths to make sure we would never know what it says. But let us get back to the collapse itself, because there is another element here that does not get talked about enough. The Indus Valley civilization was not just ahead of its time in urban planning, it was ahead in something much more important: social organization. There are no palaces in Indus cities. None. No massive temples, no royal tombs, no evidence of a king or a ruling class. The houses are remarkably uniform in size. The wealth distribution appears to have been relatively equal. This was, by all available evidence, one of the most egalitarian large-scale societies in human history. And that makes its collapse even more mysterious. Because here is what we know about how civilizations usually fall apart. They collapse from the top down. The elites overextend. They build monuments they cannot afford. They wage wars they cannot win. They extract too many resources from the people, and eventually the system breaks. But the Indus Valley did not have that structure. There was no elite class to overextend. There was no military apparatus to drain resources. So what broke? Some researchers point to environmental factors beyond just the river. There is evidence of a major shift in monsoon patterns around 1900 BCE, droughts lasting years, maybe decades, soil salinization making agriculture impossible in regions that had been fertile for generations, earthquakes changing the course of rivers, a perfect storm of natural disasters. But again, that does not explain the lack of adaptation. Humans are incredibly good at surviving environmental stress. We migrate, we innovate, we rebuild. The Indus people had the technology, the organizational capacity, and the population to weather almost any natural disaster. So why did they not? One theory, less discussed in mainstream archaeology, is that the collapse was not environmental at all. It was psychological, social, maybe even intentional. What if the Indus civilization did not fall? What if it dissolved? What if the people, for reasons we cannot fully understand, decided to abandon the urban experiment entirely? There is some evidence for this. After the cities were abandoned, the population did not disappear. They scattered into smaller villages. They simplified their lifestyle. They stopped making the elaborate seals and standardized bricks. They stopped writing things down. Within a generation or two, they had regressed, technologically speaking, by centuries. Why would a society choose to do that? Why would 5 million people collectively decide to walk away from running water, planned cities, and interregional trade networks and go back to living in small agricultural communities? Unless they had seen something, learned something, experienced something that made them believe the urban lifestyle was not worth continuing. There are anthropological parallels. Small-scale societies that have contact with modern civilization and then deliberately choose to reject it. Groups that decide the costs of complexity outweigh the benefits. But those are usually small groups. This was 5 million people making the same choice at roughly the same time. Or maybe it was not a choice. Maybe it was a forced resettlement we have no record of. Maybe there was a conquest so complete that it left no archaeological trace. Maybe the people were absorbed into another culture so thoroughly that their identity was erased. But that brings us back to the writing. If the Indus people were conquered or absorbed, someone should have been able to read their script. Someone should have passed down the knowledge. Unless the conquerors specifically wanted to erase it. Unless there was something in those texts that needed to be forgotten. I know how that sounds. I know it veers into speculation. But consider this. The Indus Valley civilization is the largest urban culture in the ancient world that we know almost nothing about. We can describe their cities in detail. We can analyze their trade goods. We can map their settlements. But we cannot tell you what they called themselves. We cannot tell you what language they spoke. We cannot tell you what they believed or how they governed or what stories they told their children. For a civilization that lasted 700 years and touched the lives of millions, that is not just a gap in the historical record. That is an erasure. And erasures, whether intentional or accidental, should make us ask questions. Questions about who controls the narrative of the past. Questions about what gets preserved and what gets forgotten. Questions about whether the speed of the Indus collapse was natural or whether something happened that someone, at some point, decided we should not remember. You know what? I am genuinely curious about something. Where in the world are you listening to this right now? And what time is it there? Are you watching this during your lunch break? Or is it 2 in the morning and you are still going down the rabbit hole? Drop your location and the time in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel and how many people across different time zones are all discovering the same hidden histories at the same moment. Because when we move to the next civilization, when we talk about the Minoans, we are going to see a pattern: advanced societies, rapid collapse, and mysteries that seem almost designed to prevent us from knowing the full truth. 1650 BCE, the island of Crete. A civilization so sophisticated that when archaeologists first uncovered it in the early 1900s, they refused to believe it was real. They thought they had found Atlantis. They were not entirely wrong. The Minoans built the first true palaces in Europe. Not castles, not fortresses, palaces. Knossos alone covered 6 acres and contained over 1,000 interconnected rooms. It had indoor plumbing with terracotta pipes. It had flushing toilets, It had hot and cold running water delivered through a pressurized system that used gravity and hydraulics in ways that would not be replicated until the Renaissance. The palace walls were covered in frescoes showing acrobats vaulting over bulls, women in elaborate dresses with exposed breasts, dolphins swimming in impossible blue seas. This was not the Bronze Age Europe we were taught about. This was something else entirely. The Minoans traded with Egypt, with Anatolia, with the Levant. Their ships controlled the eastern Mediterranean. They exported pottery, wine, olive oil, and purple dye made from murex shells. They imported tin from as far as Britain, amber from the Baltic, ivory from Africa. They were cosmopolitan, wealthy, secure. At Knossos, there are no defensive walls. None. The Minoans did not build fortifications because they did not need them. Their navy was their defense. Their culture was their power. And then, in a single day, it was gone. Not the whole civilization. Not yet. But the trigger that would destroy them happened in one afternoon, on an island 63 miles north of Crete, an island called Thera. You know it today as Santorini, a picturesque tourist destination with white buildings clinging to cliffs and stunning sunset views. But in 1628 BCE, Thera was not a crescent of cliffs. It was a mountain, a volcano. And when it erupted, it produced one of the most powerful explosions in human history. The Thera eruption was a VEI 7 event, Volcanic Explosivity Index 7. To give you perspective, Krakatoa in 1883 was a VEI 6, and that explosion was heard 3,000 miles away. Thera was 4 times larger. It ejected 16 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. It created a caldera collapse so massive that the entire center of the island sank into the sea, leaving behind the crescent shape you see today. The explosion was likely audible across half the known world. But the explosion itself was not what killed the Minoans. It was what came next. 35-meter-tall tsunami waves, multiple waves, radiating out from Thera in all directions, reaching the northern coast of Crete in less than 30 minutes. These were not waves that crashed and receded. These were walls of water moving at the speed of a jet plane, carrying the debris of destroyed coastal towns with them, amplifying their destructive power with every mile. A 2024 study analyzing sediment deposits along the northern Cretan coast found evidence of marine deposits 16 miles inland. 16 miles! The waves did not just hit the shore, they scoured entire regions clean. Every coastal settlement, every harbor, every shipyard, every fleet moored near shore, gone in hours. But here is where it gets strange. The Minoan civilization did not end in 1628 BCE. The palaces were damaged, yes. The coastal towns were destroyed, absolutely. But the Minoans rebuilt. Within a generation, Knossos was functioning again. Trade resumed. The frescoes were repainted. For another 150 years, Minoan culture persisted. Weaker, certainly. Reduced, but alive. Until 1450 BCE, when everything stopped. And this time, it was not a volcano. It was not a tsunami. This time, it was people. The Mycenaeans, Bronze Age Greeks from the mainland. Around 1450 BCE, they crossed the sea and took control of Crete. But the takeover was too clean, too organized, too much like they were expecting to find the Minoans already weakened, already vulnerable. The palaces at Knossos show signs of fire around this time, but not the kind of fire that comes from battle. More like deliberate burning, controlled destruction. The Mycenaeans moved in and adopted Minoan culture wholesale. They took over the palaces, they used the trade networks. They even adopted a version of the Minoan writing system, Linear A, and modified it into what we now call Linear B. And here is the key thing. We can read Linear B. We deciphered it in the 1950s. It is an early form of Greek, but Linear A, the original Minoan script, remains completely undeciphered, just like Indus script, just like the writing systems of civilizations that vanished too quickly. Now, let us talk about Atlantis, because this is where mythology and history collide in uncomfortable ways. Plato described Atlantis around 360 BCE in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias. He said it was a powerful naval civilization that existed 9,000 years before his time, that it controlled a vast island empire, that it was destroyed in a single day and night by earthquakes and floods, and that it sank beneath the sea. Most scholars dismiss this as allegory, a moral tale about hubris and divine punishment. But what if Plato was not making it up? What if he was passing down a garbled account of something real? The timeline does not match, obviously. Plato said 9,000 years, but the Thera eruption was only 1,200 years before his time. But oral traditions distort chronology. Numbers get exaggerated. Details get confused. What does not get confused are the core elements. A powerful island civilization, advanced architecture, control of the seas, destroyed in a day by natural catastrophe. That describes the Minoans perfectly, and there is more. Plato described Atlantis as having a central island with concentric rings of water and land. Santorini, before the eruption, would have had a circular lagoon in the middle, surrounded by the volcanic cone, surrounded by the sea. The eruption created concentric rings by collapsing the center. The geography matches. Plato also described Atlantean architecture with red, white, and black stone. The volcanic rock on Santorini is red, white, and black. He described hot and cold running water in the palaces. Knossos had that. He described bull worship. Minoan art is obsessed with bulls. The parallels are not vague. They are specific. So why do mainstream historians reject the Minoan Atlantis connection? Partly because Plato said Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which we interpret as the Strait of Gibraltar. But Bronze Age Greeks did not have precise geographic knowledge. To them, anything beyond immediate sailing distance was vaguely out there somewhere. The Atlantic and the Eastern Mediterranean could easily blur in retellings passed down over 1,000 years. But there is another reason the connection gets dismissed, and it is less academic. Atlantis has been claimed by too many crackpots. It has been placed in Antarctica, in the Bermuda Triangle, in South America, in Indonesia. It has been connected to aliens, to psychic powers, to ancient high technology. The legitimate possibility that Plato was describing a real place, a real civilization, gets drowned out by the noise of pseudo-archaeology. And so serious scholars avoid the topic entirely. They do not want to be associated with the fringe theories, which means a potentially valid historical connection goes unexplored because the conversation has been poisoned. That is how suppression works in academia. Not through conspiracy, through stigma, through the fear of being labeled unserious, through the risk of losing funding or credibility. You do not need shadowy organizations hiding evidence. You just need a professional culture that punishes certain lines of inquiry. And the Minoan Atlantis connection has been thoroughly stigmatized. But let us return to what actually happened. Whether or not Plato was describing them, the Minoans were destroyed, and the method of destruction raises troubling questions. The Mycenaean takeover of Crete happens right after the 1450 BCE destruction layer. Right after. The timing is too convenient. Either the Mycenaeans got incredibly lucky, arriving just as Minoan defenses collapsed for unrelated reasons, or they knew something was coming, or they caused it. There is no evidence of a second eruption at Thera in 1450 BCE, but there is evidence of earthquakes across the eastern Mediterranean during this period. Crete sits on a major fault line, regular seismic activity. What if the Mycenaeans knew the region was unstable? What if they waited for the next major earthquake, then struck while the Minoans were literally picking up the pieces? That would explain the lack of major battle damage. That would explain the quick transition of power. That would explain why Mycenaean culture simply absorbed Minoan culture rather than destroying it. They were not conquerors in the traditional sense. They were opportunists, scavengers arriving after the real disaster had already done the work. And the Minoans, weakened by a century and a half of environmental catastrophe, could not resist. The tsunami of 1628 BCE had destroyed their fleet. The loss of coastal settlements had disrupted their trade. The psychological trauma of living on an island where the sea could rise 35 meters without warning, where the ground could shake and palaces could collapse, where ash clouds could blot out the sun, that trauma does not heal quickly. By 1450 BCE, the Minoans were already ghosts. The Mycenaeans just made it official. But here's the final twist. Genetic analysis of modern Cretans shows almost no trace of Minoan DNA. None. The Minoans did not just lose their civilization. Their genetic lineage was erased. Either they died out completely, which seems unlikely, or they were absorbed so thoroughly into the Mycenaean population that their distinct genetic markers vanished. That level of genetic erasure takes intentional mixing, intermarriage, cultural assimilation, the deliberate destruction of a separate identity. The Minoans were not just conquered, they were unmade. Their script was replaced. Their genetics were diluted. Their story was forgotten until archaeologists stumbled onto their ruins 3,000 years later. If Plato had not written about Atlantis, if Arthur Evans had not excavated Knossos in 1900, we might never have known they existed at all. That is what a true collapse looks like. Not just the end of a government or an economy, the end of a people, the end of a language, the end of memory itself. And it started with a volcano and ended with an invasion that almost nobody in the ancient world bothered to write down. The Minoans built the most advanced civilization in Bronze Age Europe, and within 200 years of a single bad day, they were gone. Not just defeated, erased. The high desert of northwestern New Mexico does not look like a place where a civilization should thrive. Barely 10 inches of rain per year. Summer temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. Winter cold that drops below freezing. No major rivers, no forests, no obvious resources. And yet, between 800 and 1200 CE, the ancestral Puebloans built something in Chaco Canyon that still defuses explanation. We are not talking about villages. We are talking about engineered monuments on a scale that rivals anything in Mesoamerica. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of the great houses, contained over 600 rooms and rose 4 stories high. Its walls were constructed with such precision that modern masons struggle to replicate the technique. The building required over 200,000 trees, none of which grew anywhere near Chaco Canyon. The nearest forests were 50 miles away, over the mountains. And remember, these people had no wheels, no horses, no pack animals of any kind. They carried those trees on their backs, across mountain ranges, for decades, but the great houses are just the beginning. Radiating out from Chaco Canyon are roads, perfectly straight roads, not trails, not footpaths. Engineered roads 30 feet wide, cut through solid rock in some places, ramped over cliffs in others, extending in absolutely straight lines for hundreds of miles regardless of terrain. Over 400 miles of roads have been mapped, and archaeologists believe that is only a fraction of the original network. Here is the problem. These roads do not make sense. They connect to outlying great houses, sure, but they do so in the least efficient way possible. They go straight instead of following natural contours. They maintain their width and construction quality even in remote areas where almost no one lived. And strangest of all, many of them lead to absolutely nothing. They just stop in the middle of nowhere. Why would you build a highway to nowhere? Why would you expend that much labor, that much planning, that much social organization on infrastructure that does not serve an obvious economic purpose? Some archaeologists think the roads were ceremonial, pilgrimage routes. But that raises another question. Pilgrimage to what? What belief system requires perfectly engineered 30-foot wide roads through the desert? The great houses themselves present similar mysteries. Pueblo Bonito could theoretically house hundreds of families, but the archaeological evidence shows that very few people actually lived there. Most of the rooms show no signs of habitation, no hearths, no trash middens, no wear patterns on the floors. These were not apartment buildings. They were something else. Storage facilities, maybe. Ceremonial centers, possibly. Or something we do not have a category for yet. And then there is the astronomy. The great houses are aligned to solar and lunar events with precision that requires generations of observation. At Pueblo Bonito, during the summer solstice, light enters specific windows and illuminates specific petroglyphs at specific times. At Casa Rinconada, the Great Kiva, shafts of light mark the equinoxes. These people were tracking celestial cycles with the accuracy of modern observatories, using architecture as their instrument. All of this required a level of social cohesion that should not have been possible. No evidence of a king, no palaces, no standing army. And yet somehow, The people of Chaco organized labor on a massive scale for over 300 years. They built. They traded turquoise with cultures 1,000 miles away. They created a regional system that influenced communities across the entire Four Corners region. And then, between 1130 and 1180 CE, it fell apart, not gradually, catastrophically. The tree ring data tells the story. Starting in 1130 CE, the Southwest entered a drought unlike anything in the previous 2,000 years, year after year of failed crops, springs drying up, game animals migrating away. This was not a bad year or even a bad decade. This was a 50-year environmental collapse that broke the fragile agricultural system the ancestral Puebloans had built their entire civilization on. By 1180 CE, Chaco Canyon was abandoned. The great houses were empty. The roads were no longer maintained. The regional trade network dissolved. The people scattered to smaller communities, to cliff dwellings in Mesa Verde and Canyon de Chelly, to river valleys where water was more reliable. Within a single generation, a culture that had dominated the region for centuries simply ceased to exist as a cohesive entity. But here is where we need to address something that most documentaries about the ancestral Puebloans avoid. Something dark, something that makes archaeologists extremely uncomfortable. There is evidence of cannibalism at multiple sites dating to the final decades of the Chaco system. Not ritual cannibalism, not symbolic. Survival cannibalism, the kind that happens when societies collapse and people get desperate. At several sites, archaeologists have found human bones mixed with animal bones in trash heaps. The human bones show cut marks consistent with butchering. They show impact fractures consistent with breaking bones to extract marrow. And perhaps most disturbingly, coprolite analysis, the study of fossilized feces, has confirmed the presence of human myoglobin. That means someone ate human muscle tissue and then defecated at these sites. This is not speculation. This is hard evidence, and it points to something horrifying. The end of the Chaco system was not a peaceful migration to greener pastures. It was violent. It was desperate. It was people doing things humans only do when all other options have failed. Now, some scholars push back on the cannibalism interpretation. They argue that the evidence could represent violence against enemies, that the bodies were desecrated but not eaten, that the myoglobin could have come from contamination. These are fair critiques. Archaeological interpretation is never certain, but the pattern is consistent across multiple sites, multiple time periods, all concentrated in the decades when the drought was at its worst. That is not coincidence. What this suggests is that the collapse of Chaco was not just environmental, it was social. The drought created scarcity. Scarcity created competition. Competition created violence. And at some point, the social bonds that had held this culture together for 300 years snapped. The great houses, those massive structures that required coordinated labor from thousands of people, became symbols of a system that had failed. Why maintain ceremonial centers when the ceremonies did not bring rain? Why send offerings to Chaco when Chaco could not provide security or resources in return? The entire ideological foundation of the Chaco system was based on the idea that the elites, the people who controlled the great houses, had special access to supernatural power, that they could mediate between humans and the forces that controlled rain, crops, and prosperity. 50 years of drought proved them wrong, and when the ideology failed, the system collapsed. Fast. By 1200 CE, no one lived in Chaco Canyon anymore. The descendants of the Chaco people moved into cliff dwellings, places that could be defended. They became more insular, more violent. The archaeological record from this period shows increasing fortification, increasing trauma on skeletal remains, increasing evidence of warfare. The collapse did not end with the abandonment of Chaco. It triggered a century of regional instability that only stabilized when entirely new social systems emerged. And here's the thing that ties this to our larger pattern. The ancestral Puebloans had the knowledge to survive drought. They had been dealing with arid conditions for centuries. They had irrigation, they had true storage techniques, they had trade networks. On paper, they should have adapted, but they did not, because the drought did not just threaten their crops. It threatened their entire worldview. When the center cannot hold, when the institutions people trust fail them, when the leaders cannot deliver what they promised, societies do not adapt gradually. They fragment, they turn on each other. They abandon complexity and retreat to smaller, more manageable social units. That is what happened at Chaco, and it happened fast. Within 20 to 30 years, a culture that had built some of the most impressive architecture in North America was gone. The people survived. Their descendants are the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona. But the culture, the specific way of organizing society that produced Chaco, that died. And it died quickly enough that later generations did not even preserve the memory of why those massive buildings existed or what those roads were for. The ancestral Puebloans are proof that you do not need invasion to destroy a civilization. You do not need plague or tsunami or volcanic eruption. All you need is environmental stress, social fragmentation, and the failure of the systems people believed in. Give it a few decades, and even the most impressive monuments become ruins that no one understands. And if you think that sounds familiar, if you think that has echoes of our own moment, well, that is exactly why these stories matter. Because collapse is not ancient history, it is a pattern. And patterns repeat. Ask most people to name a powerful ancient African empire, and you will get Egypt, maybe Carthage if they paid attention in history class. Almost no one will say Aksum. And that absence, that blank space in our collective historical knowledge, is not an accident. It is the result of centuries of Eurocentric historiography that has systematically erased one of the most important civilizations in the ancient world. Between 100 and 900 CE, the Aksumite Empire controlled trade routes spanning 3 continents. Their capital, also called Aksum, sat in the highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia. From there, they dominated the Red Sea, taxed trade between Rome and India, minted gold coins that circulated from Britain to Sri Lanka, and fielded armies that could challenge Persia. The 3rd century Persian prophet Mani listed 4 great kingdoms of the world: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. Not Egypt, not Greece. Aksum. This was not a regional power. This was a superpower. And we do not teach it in schools. The physical evidence of Aksumite greatness still stands. The obelisk of Aksum, erected in the 4th century CE, weighs 160 tons and stands 79 feet tall. It was carved from a single piece of granite and transported from a quarry miles away. No one knows exactly how they moved it. The obelisk is carved to resemble a multi-story tower, with false windows and doors, and a crescent and disc symbol at the top. It is one of the largest single pieces of stone ever erected by humans, and it is just one of hundreds. The stele fields around Aksum contain thousands of stone markers, ranging from simple slabs to elaborately carved towers. Many are inscribed in Ge'ez, the ancient Ethiopian script that is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy today. Unlike Linear A, unlike Indus script, we can read Ge'ez. We know what these monuments say. They commemorate kings. They describe military victories. They declare religious devotion. And yet, despite having readable primary sources, Aksum remains obscure in Western education. Why? Let us be direct about this. Racism. The assumption, embedded deep in 19th and early 20th century archaeology, that Africans could not have built complex civilizations without outside influence. When European scholars first encountered Aksumite ruins, they attributed them to Arabs, to Indians, to anyone except the local population. The idea that black Africans could mint coins, build skyscrapers, and dominate international trade did not fit the narrative that justified colonialism. So Aksum was ignored, diminished, or reattributed. Even today, the Aksumite Empire gets maybe a paragraph in world history textbooks, usually in a sidebar about the spread of Christianity. And yes, Aksum was one of the first Christian kingdoms, converting in the 4th century under King Ezana. But reducing them to a footnote in the story of Christianity is like reducing Rome to a footnote in the story of Rhodes. It misses the scale. It misses the significance. It misses the fact that, for half a millennium, Aksum was one of the most powerful states on Earth. So, how did it collapse? And why did it collapse so completely that most people today have never heard of it? The official story goes like this. Starting in the 7th century CE, the Islamic conquests cut off Aksumite trade routes through the Red Sea. Egypt, Arabia, North Africa, all fell to Muslim armies within a few decades. Aksum, a Christian kingdom now surrounded by Islamic powers, was isolated. Trade revenue dried up. The empire weakened. By 900 CE, the capital was abandoned, and Aksumite power had dissolved into smaller regional kingdoms. That is the version you will find in most histories, but it leaves out some critical details. First, the climate. The late antique Little Ice Age, a global cooling period that lasted from 536 to around 660 CE, devastated agriculture across the world. Tree ring data shows consecutive years of crop failure. Historical records from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia all describe famines, plagues, and social upheaval during this period. Aksum, dependent on highland agriculture, would have been hit hard. Population decline, food insecurity, the weakening of state capacity. Then the environment, deforestation. Aksumite expansion required massive amounts of wood for construction, for fuel, for the fires needed to smelt iron and cast bronze. By the 8th century, the highlands around Aksum had been stripped of trees. Soil erosion followed. Agricultural productivity collapsed. This was not sudden drought like Chaco. This was slow environmental degradation that eventually crossed a threshold and made the region uninhabitable at the population density required to sustain an empire. But here is where it gets interesting. The Islamic expansion did not just cut off trade. It offered an alternative. Aksumite merchants could convert to Islam and continue trading. Many did. The ports along the Red Sea continued to function, but the wealth stopped flowing to Aksum. It flowed to new Islamic centers, Mecca, Medina, later, Cairo. The economic foundation of the empire shifted away from the Christian highlands to the Muslim coast, and the Aksumite kings, who had built their legitimacy on controlling that trade, on minting those coins, on projecting power across the Red Sea, suddenly had nothing to offer. No trade revenue meant no army. No army meant no ability to enforce tributary relationships with outlying regions. No tribute meant no resources to maintain the capital. The whole system unraveled. But the speed is what matters. Within 50 years, Aksum went from minting coins and erecting monuments to complete obscurity. By 940 CE, the last inscriptions stop. The capital is abandoned. The stele fields are left to the elements. And the Aksumite Empire, which had stood for 800 years, simply ceases to exist as a coherent political entity. What happened to the people? They did not die. They did not vanish. They fragmented. The Aksumite state collapsed, but Ethiopian culture continued. The Orthodox Church survived. The Ge'ez script survived. The royal lineage, or at least the claim to it, survived all the way to Haile Selassie in the 20th century. But the empire itself, the centralized state that controlled trade and built monuments, that was gone. And it was gone so completely that by the time Europeans arrived in the 15th century, even the locals had only vague legends about who built the stele. Now, there is one more element to this story that we need to address: the Ark of the Covenant. Aksumite tradition claims that the Ark of the Covenant, the chest containing the Ten Commandments, was brought from Jerusalem to Aksum in the 10th century BCE by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains that the Ark is currently housed in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum, guarded by a single monk who is the only person allowed to see it, no one else. Not scholars, not priests, not even the Ethiopian emperor. One monk, chosen for life, and when he dies, another is chosen. Is it real? Almost certainly not. The historical evidence for the Queen of Sheba visiting Solomon is thin. The timeline does not match. The story has all the hallmarks of origin mythology, a way for Aksumite kings to legitimize their power by connecting themselves to biblical lineage. But here is the thing: we do not know for sure, because no one is allowed to verify. The Church refuses all requests for examination, even non-invasive imaging, even external verification of the claim. The Ark, real or not, is sealed away behind religious authority that permits no questioning. And that brings us back to the larger theme: suppressed information. not always through conspiracy, but through cultural gatekeeping. The Ark story is probably myth, but it is myth that serves a purpose. It preserves Ethiopian identity as uniquely connected to biblical history. It maintains the authority of the Orthodox Church, and it keeps Aksum relevant in a way that archaeological ruins alone might not. But it also means we cannot know. Just like we cannot read Indus script because excavation is restricted, just like we do not teach Aksum in Western schools because it contradicts racist narratives about African capability. Just like we avoid discussing ancestral Puebloan cannibalism because it complicates noble savage stereotypes. Information gets suppressed, not always through active censorship, but through the structures of who gets to decide what is worth knowing. Aksum collapsed fast. Environmental degradation, climate change, economic isolation, religious transformation, all of it happening within a century. A superpower reduced to legend, and if the gatekeepers of historical narrative had their way, it would have stayed legend. Just another forgotten empire that does not fit the story we tell ourselves about how civilizations rise and fall. But Aksum did exist. The coins prove it. The monuments prove it. The inscriptions prove it. And the fact that it collapsed so thoroughly, so quickly, proves something else. That size does not guarantee survival. That power does not ensure memory. That even empires that stand for 8 centuries can be erased from history if the people who write the textbooks decide they are not worth mentioning. 1200 BCE. The entire eastern Mediterranean is on fire, not metaphorically, literally. Archaeological excavation layers from this period show burnt destruction at nearly every major Bronze Age site from Greece to Egypt. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, Ugarit, Hattusa, Troy, Megiddo, one after another, the great cities of the late Bronze Age were sacked, burned, and abandoned within a span of roughly 50 years. This was not a regional conflict. This was civilizational collapse on a scale not seen again until the fall of Rome over 1,000 years later. And we do not know who did it. The Egyptians called them the Sea Peoples. That is it. That is all we have. Egyptian records from the time of Ramesses III describe massive naval invasions by coalitions of foreign warriors who came from the sea, who destroyed everything in their path, and who nearly conquered Egypt itself. The temple walls at Medinet Habu show reliefs of naval battles, of Egyptian ships fighting strange vessels crewed by men wearing feathered headdresses and horned helmets. The inscriptions name groups, the Peliset, the Tijaker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, but they do not say where these groups came from or why they suddenly appeared. Here is what makes the Sea Peoples so frustrating. They are the most documented unknown in ancient history. We have Egyptian accounts of fighting them. We have evidence of their destruction across dozens of sites. We have artifacts that show the movement of new populations into previously settled areas. But we have no records from the Sea Peoples themselves. No inscriptions saying, "We are the Peliset and we came from this place for this reason." Nothing. They appear. They destroy. They vanish back into anonymity. The prevailing theory for decades was that these were displaced populations, refugees fleeing from environmental collapse or invasions in their homelands, and that they migrated violently through the Mediterranean looking for new places to settle. The domino effect theory? Something pushed the Sea Peoples. They pushed the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans pushed others, and the whole system collapsed like falling dominoes. But that theory has problems, big problems. First, the destruction is too coordinated. Sites across the eastern Mediterranean burned within years of each other, not decades. That suggests organized military campaigns, not desperate refugees. Second, the Sea Peoples were not just migrants. They were a naval power sophisticated enough to challenge Egyptian war fleets. Building ships requires resources, infrastructure, and social organization. Refugees do not have that. Third, the population movements do not entirely match the destruction pattern. Some destroyed cities were resettled by the same culture that destroyed them, suggesting internal collapse, not external invasion. So, what actually happened? The honest answer is, we do not know, but we can piece together a picture from what we do know. The Mycenaean civilization that emerged after the conquest of the Minoans was fundamentally different. Where the Minoans built open palaces, the Mycenaeans built fortresses. Massive cyclopean walls made from stones so large that later Greeks believed they were built by giants. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, with its 16-ton lintel stone, was designed to impress and intimidate. This was a warrior culture, a culture built on conquest, on tribute, on hierarchical control, and it worked. For 3 centuries, the Mycenaeans dominated the Aegean. They traded with the Hittites in Anatolia, with Egypt, with the Levant. They produced elaborate pottery that spread across the Mediterranean. They built palaces that required thousands of workers and scribes to administer. The Linear B tablets, thousands of them, give us detailed records of palace economies, lists of workers, inventories of grain, rosters of military equipment. These were bureaucratic states with centralized control and complex administrative systems. But those same tablets reveal something troubling: fragility. The palace economies were not robust. They were tightly managed systems operating with very little margin for error. Bad harvest? The tablets show emergency requisitions of grain. Labor shortage? The tablets show forced mobilization of workers from outlying areas. The Mycenaean world was prosperous, but it was also brittle, and brittle systems break suddenly when stressed. Around 1200 BCE, the stresses started compounding. Climate data shows the beginning of a sustained drought across the eastern Mediterranean. Not as severe as the Chaco megadrought, but severe enough. Crops failed. Food stores depleted. The palace economies, which relied on agricultural surplus to pay workers and support the military, started running deficits. At the same time, trade networks began failing. Ugarit, a major trading hub on the Syrian coast, sent desperate letters to neighboring kingdoms in the years before its destruction. One letter, found in the ruins, pleads for grain shipments. Another mentions ships of enemies appearing off the coast. Another describes the king sending his entire army somewhere, leaving the city defenseless. And then Ugarit burned, and the letters stopped. The Hittite Empire, which had controlled Anatolia for centuries, collapsed around the same time. Their capital, Hattusa, was abandoned so quickly that the royal archives were left in place. Thousands of clay tablets just sitting in the ruins, waiting for archaeologists to find them 3,000 years later. Those tablets show a kingdom in crisis, food shortages, rebellions in outlying provinces, desperate diplomatic appeals for assistance. And then, nothing. This is the pattern across the entire Late Bronze Age world. Not just the Mycenaeans, everyone. The interconnected system of trade and diplomacy that had linked the eastern Mediterranean for centuries was collapsing, and the collapse was feeding on itself. Trade routes failed, so cities could not get resources they needed. So they could not pay their armies. So they could not defend against raiders. So trade routes failed further. A death spiral. And into that spiral came the Sea Peoples. But here is the key insight. The Sea Peoples were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were the symptom. They were what happens when centralized states fail and populations fragment. Some of those fragments formed raiding coalitions. Some migrated. Some fought each other. And the Egyptians, seeing these fragmented groups attacking from the sea, lumped them all together under one label, Sea Peoples, as if they were a unified force. But they probably were not. They were dozens of different groups, with different origins, all taking advantage of the same collapsing system. The Mycenaeans were part of that collapse. Some Mycenaean cities show evidence of internal destruction. Pylos burned, but there is no evidence of foreign invasion. The palace was destroyed, but the surrounding town continued to be inhabited. That looks like internal conflict, revolution, maybe, or civil war. In other cities, the destruction looks more like raiding. Quick strikes, burn the palace, take the valuables, leave. Not occupation, just violence. By 1100 BCE, every major Mycenaean palace was abandoned. The administrative system collapsed. The Linear B script, used exclusively for palace bureaucracy, stopped being written. Within a single generation, literacy disappeared from Greece, not because the knowledge was lost. The script was not particularly complicated, but because the institutions that required literacy no longer existed. No palaces, no bureaucrats, no need to keep records. And so people stopped writing things down. This is what makes the Bronze Age collapse so terrifying from a modern perspective. Literacy is not inevitable. Technology is not inevitable. Complexity is not inevitable. All of it rests on institutional structures that maintain and transmit knowledge. When those structures fail, the knowledge goes with them. The Mycenaeans did not forget how to read because of a plague that killed everyone who knew the script. They forgot because within a generation, no one needed to read anymore, so no one bothered teaching it. For 300 years, from 1100 to 800 BCE, Greece entered what we call the Dark Ages. Not dark because people were primitive, but dark because we have almost no written records. The archaeological evidence shows smaller settlements, less trade, simpler pottery. Not a return to the Stone Age, but a significant decrease in social complexity. Population declined. Monumental architecture stopped. The great citadels were left to crumble. And here is the thing that ties this to everything else we have discussed. The Mycenaeans had all the tools to prevent collapse. They had writing, they had bureaucracy, they had trade networks, they had military power. On paper, they were equipped to handle drought, to handle economic stress, to handle external threats, but they collapsed anyway, because tools are not enough, systems are not enough. When the stresses compound, when the margins disappear, when people lose faith in the institutions that govern them, collapse happens fast, faster than anyone expects. The Sea Peoples are a mystery because collapse creates mysteries. When systems fail, records stop being kept. When institutions dissolve, no one writes down why. The people living through it are too busy surviving to document what is happening, and the people who come after inherit ruins and fragmented oral traditions that do not quite make sense. That is why we do not know who the Sea Peoples were, not because they were particularly mysterious, but because the collapse they participated in destroyed the very mechanisms that would have preserved their story. The Mycenaeans could have told us. The Hittites could have told us. Ugarit could have told us. But those civilizations burned. Their archives scattered. Their literate classes disappeared. And by the time Greeks started writing again, 300 years later, the Bronze Age collapse was already half legend. The Trojan War, assuming it happened at all, became the Iliad. Actual history became mythology. And the Sea Peoples became ghosts. So let us stop and look at what we have. 5 civilizations, 5 collapses, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Different climates, different cultures, different technologies. And yet, when you line them up, patterns emerge that should make us extremely uncomfortable. First, the speed. None of these collapses were gradual. The Indus Valley civilization had 20 years. The Minoans had a generation after the tsunami. Chaco Canyon emptied in 3 decades. Aksum went from superpower to obscurity in 50 years. The entire Bronze Age Mediterranean burned in less than a century. These are not slow declines. These are system failures, the kind where everything seems fine until suddenly it is not. Second, the silence. In every case, we have ruins but no explanations. The Indus script is unreadable. Linear A is unreadable. The ancestral Puebloans left no written records at all. Aksum stopped writing inscriptions mid-sentence. Essentially, the Mycenaeans lost literacy entirely. It is as if these civilizations hit a threshold where the capacity to record what was happening disappeared at exactly the moment when recording it would have mattered most. Third, the environmental component. Every single collapse corresponds with climate anomalies. The Indus Valley and the drying of the Saraswati, the Minoans and the Thera eruption, Chaco and the 50-year megadrought, Aksum and the late antique Little Ice Age, the Mycenaeans and the eastern Mediterranean drought of 1200 BCE. This is not coincidence. Climate stress is the background condition for all of these events. But here is where it gets deeper. Here is where we need to talk about cycles. If you look at solar activity over the past 10,000 years, using ice core data and tree ring analysis, you find periods of reduced solar output that correlate with global cooling events. The Maunder minimum in the 1600s, the Spur minimum in the 1400s, the Dalton minimum in the early 1800s. Each one corresponds with crop failures, famines, and social instability. The Little Ice Age that helped collapse Aksum was one of these solar minimums. So was the drought that hit the eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age collapse. Now, extend that pattern backwards. 12,800 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, global temperatures spiked upward in a geological instant, then plunged back into near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. This is called the Younger Dryas, and it is one of the most dramatic climate reversals in the entire geological record. Temperatures dropped 10 degrees Celsius in less than a decade. Ice sheets that had been retreating suddenly expanded again. Megafauna that had survived the ice age went extinct, and human populations, which had been growing and developing more complex societies, collapsed back into smaller, more mobile groups. For decades, the Younger Dryas was explained as a natural climate oscillation, melting ice sheets disrupting ocean currents, feedback loops in the climate system, standard gradualist geology. But in 2018, researchers found a platinum spike in Greenland ice cores dated to exactly 12,800 years ago. Platinum does not appear naturally in ice. It comes from extraterrestrial sources, asteroids, comets. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that a fragmented comet struck the North American ice sheet, triggering massive wildfires, ejecting enough dust into the atmosphere to cause a nuclear winter effect, and potentially destabilizing the ice sheet itself, leading to catastrophic flooding. The evidence keeps accumulating: nanodiamonds in the sediment layer, shocked quartz, spherules consistent with high-temperature impact events, burned layers across North America showing simultaneous continent-wide fires. And this was not just an environmental disaster, this was a civilizational reset. The Clovis culture, the dominant human culture in North America at the time, disappears from the archaeological record right at the Younger Dryas boundary. Sophisticated tool-making traditions stop, population densities crash. Whatever social complexity was developing got erased. But mainstream archaeology resists this interpretation. Hard, the official position of most major institutions is that the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is speculative, that the evidence is inconclusive, that catastrophism is bad science. And there is a reason for that resistance. Catastrophism threatens the uniformitarian paradigm that has dominated geology and archaeology for 2 centuries. Uniformitarianism is the idea that geological and climatic processes happen gradually, at rates we can observe and measure today. It is the foundation of how we date rock layers, how we interpret fossil records, how we construct timelines of human development. If catastrophic events can reset everything in a single day, if comets can wipe out civilizations without warning, then the slow, steady model of change that we have built entire academic fields on becomes unreliable. And unreliable models mean uncertain funding. Uncertain funding means career risk. So the incentive structure of academia pushes researchers away from catastrophism, even when the evidence supports it. This is not conspiracy. This is institutional inertia. This is the way paradigms protect themselves. Graham Hancock has been saying this for decades. Randall Carlson has been presenting geological evidence for catastrophic flooding at the end of the Ice Age since the 1970s. And both have been marginalized, dismissed as pseudoscientists, excluded from serious academic discourse. Not because their evidence is fraudulent, but because their conclusions threaten the consensus. And in academia, threatening the consensus is professional suicide. But the evidence does not care about consensus. The platinum spike is real. The nanodiamonds are real. The burned layer is real. The sudden collapse of megafauna populations is real. The Younger Dryas temperature drop is real, and if a comet impact 12,800 years ago can trigger global catastrophe, then we need to ask a very uncomfortable question. Could it happen again? Actually, we do not need to ask. We know it can happen again. In 1994, comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 slammed into Jupiter with enough force to create fireballs larger than Earth. We watched it happen. We measured the impact energy. If that comet had hit Earth instead of Jupiter, human civilization would have ended, not declined, not collapsed over generations, ended in hours. So here is the pattern. Civilizations build complexity. Complexity requires stability. Stability is an illusion maintained by environmental conditions that happen to be favorable. When those conditions shift, when droughts last too long, when temperatures drop too fast, When trade routes fail, when resources deplete, complexity becomes a liability. The more interconnected a system, the more catastrophic its failure when critical nodes break down. The Indus Valley, Minoans, ancestral Puebloans, Aksumites, and Mycenaeans were all highly complex societies. They all depended on stable environmental conditions. They all had interconnected trade and administrative systems. And they all collapsed when multiple stresses hit simultaneously. Drought plus trade failure, tsunami plus invasion, climate change plus economic isolation. The specifics vary, but the mechanics are the same. Complex systems are fragile, and fragility kills fast. Now, let us talk about magnetic field reversals, because this is where the pattern gets even stranger. Earth's magnetic field is not stable. It flips. North becomes south. South becomes north. This has happened hundreds of times over geological history. We know this from paleomagnetism, from measuring the orientation of iron particles in ancient lava flows. The last full reversal was 780,000 years ago, the Brunhes-Matuyama reversal. But there have been shorter events called excursions, where the field weakens dramatically without fully reversing. The last Champ excursion, 41,000 years ago. The Gothenburg excursion, 12,500 years ago. During these events, Earth's magnetic field strength dropped to 10 or 15% of normal. That means less protection from solar radiation. That means more cosmic rays hitting the atmosphere. That means increased cloud formation, climate disruption, and potential damage to anything electronic. Except 40,000 years ago, there was nothing electronic to damage. Just humans, just animals, just ecosystems trying to survive increased radiation exposure and rapid climate shifts. And guess what corresponds with the Gothenburg excursion? The Younger Dryas. The timing matches almost perfectly. Weakened magnetosphere, comet impact, global temperature collapse, civilizational reset, all within the same narrow window of time. Are these connected? We do not know, but the coincidence is troubling. And if there is a cyclical pattern to these events, if catastrophic resets happen on regular intervals tied to solar cycles, cosmic impacts, or magnetic excursions, then we need to consider the possibility that the collapses we have been discussing are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger pattern, a pattern that repeats, a pattern that we are overdue for. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. What time is it where you are right now? Seriously, drop it in the comments. I am curious how many of you are watching this late at night, going down the rabbit hole, questioning everything you thought you knew about history. Because that is what these patterns do. They make you question. They make you wonder if maybe, just maybe, the official story is incomplete. Not wrong necessarily, just incomplete. And here is the final piece. Institutional suppression. Not through conspiracy, but through the architecture of how knowledge is validated. Peer review, grant funding, academic tenure, publishing in approved journals. All of these systems create barriers to heterodox ideas. If your research suggests catastrophism, you will struggle to get funding. If your conclusions challenge gradualist models, you will struggle to publish. If you question established timelines, you will be labeled a pseudoscientist. Not because you are wrong, but because you are inconvenient. The Pentagon classifies climate reports. Why? Because accurate climate projections reveal vulnerabilities that could be exploited by adversaries. Because telling the public how fragile our systems actually are could cause panic. Because maintaining the illusion of stability is politically necessary, even when the science says otherwise. That is suppression, not burning books, not silencing dissidents, just controlling what gets funded, what gets published, what gets taught. And over time, that control shapes what we think we know about the past, and what we think is possible in the future. The 5 civilizations we have discussed collapsed fast, faster than anyone expected, faster than the historical record should allow. And the reason we do not talk about them more, the reason they are not central to how we teach history, is because they are uncomfortable. They suggest that our own complexity, our own interconnected global systems, our own dependence on stable climate and functioning institutions, might be just as fragile. And if that is true, if collapse can happen in a generation, then we are not studying ancient history. We are studying our own future. Let me show you something. 1228 BCE, the Indus Valley empties. 1628 BCE, Thera erupts and the Minoans begin their decline. 1150 CE, Chaco Canyon goes silent. 940 CE, Aksum fades from history. 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age world burns. 5 civilizations, 5 points on a timeline stretching across 4,000 years. Connect them, and what do you see? You see that collapse is not the exception, it is the rule. We tell ourselves a story about human progress, a story where civilizations rise, stumble occasionally, but ultimately advance toward greater complexity, greater stability, greater control over our environment. Rome fell, sure, but it took centuries, and we learned from it. The Maya declined, but we understand why. We have built systems, we think, that prevent the kind of rapid, catastrophic failure that erased the Minoans or silenced the Indus Valley. We have global communication, we have scientific knowledge, we have early warning systems for everything from hurricanes to economic crashes. We are different, we are smarter, we have learned, except we have not. Right now, in 2025, global supply chains operate on just-in-time delivery models with almost zero redundancy. A single shipping container stuck in the Suez Canal can cause shortages across 3 continents. A cyber attack on a single pipeline can create gas shortages across the eastern United States. A drought in Taiwan can halt global semiconductor production. Our complexity, the thing we think makes us resilient, is actually what makes us fragile. Just like the palace economies of the Mycenaeans. Just like the trade networks of Aksum. Just like the ceremonial system at Chaco that worked perfectly until it did not. We are living in a Mycenaean world, highly interconnected, tightly managed, operating with thin margins. And when the margins disappear, systems do not adapt gracefully. They break fast. Climate data shows we are experiencing temperature increases faster than any natural cycle in the past 10,000 years. Not the past century, the past 10,000 years. Arctic ice is disappearing at rates that were considered impossible 2 decades ago. Ocean currents that regulate global weather patterns are slowing. Topsoil, the foundation of agriculture, is eroding at rates 60 times faster than it can regenerate. These are not predictions, these are measurements, and they are accelerating. The ancestral Puebloans faced a 50-year drought and could not adapt. We are facing compound environmental stresses that make that drought look manageable, and we are pretending we have it under control because the grocery stores are still stocked and the lights still turn on. But the Puebloans had stocked granaries too, right up until they did not. The pattern is always the same. Everything seems fine. Then it seems less fine, but still manageable. Then the systems people depend on start failing in small ways. A shortage here, a disruption there, nothing catastrophic, not yet. And then, very suddenly, multiple failures cascade. The people in Cahokia did not wake up one morning and decide to abandon 40,000-person city. They woke up to a situation where staying was no longer viable, and by the time that became clear, the window for organized adaptation had already closed. That is the thing about overnight collapse. It is never actually overnight. It is a series of stresses that compound over years or decades, invisible to most people, until a threshold is crossed and the facade of stability shatters. And from the outside, to people who were not paying attention to the warning signs, it looks sudden. It looks like it came out of nowhere. It never comes out of nowhere. So what do we do with this information? What does it mean to know that 5 major civilizations, spanning 4,000 years, all collapse faster than conventional models predict? What does it mean to know that academic institutions resist catastrophist explanations even when the evidence supports them? What does it mean to know that the complexity we think protects us might be the thing that destroys us? It means we ask better questions. It means we stop assuming that progress is linear. It means we stop trusting institutions that tell us everything is fine when the data says otherwise. It means we look at history not as a story of primitive people who did not know better, but as a record of societies just as complex, just as confident, just as convinced of their permanence as we are, who discovered too late that permanence is an illusion. And it means we remember the mysteries, the scripts we still cannot read, the Indus Valley symbols that might contain knowledge we desperately need but cannot access because we do not have the key. Linear A, still undeciphered after a century of trying. What if those symbols contain information about how the Minoans responded to environmental stress? What if the Harappans encoded solutions to drought management that we are reinventing from scratch? We will never know. The knowledge is there, carved in stone, pressed into clay, and we cannot read it. That is what we lose when civilizations collapse. Not just buildings, not just trade routes. We lose knowledge. We lose literacy. We lose institutional memory. The Bronze Age collapse erased 300 years of technological development. The survivors did not just lose palaces. They lost the ability to smelt bronze in some regions. They lost writing. They lost mathematical systems. They lost architectural techniques. It took centuries to rebuild what was destroyed in decades, and there are still mysteries we have not touched. Rongorongo, the script of Easter Island, undeciphered. The Antikythera mechanism, a 2,000-year-old analog computer found in a shipwreck, so sophisticated that nothing comparable appears in the historical record for another 1,500 years. Where did that knowledge come from? Where did it go? Greek fire, the Byzantine superweapon that burned on water, formula lost. Damascus steel, folded thousands of times to create blades that could cut through European swords, technique lost. Roman concrete that gets stronger with age and can set underwater, formula lost. We live on top of ruins filled with answers we cannot access because the people who knew are gone and they did not write it down. Or they did write it down and we cannot read it, or they did write it down and someone decided we should not be allowed to read it. And yes, there are suppressed sites. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, 11,000 years old, built by people who were not supposed to have the organization or technology to build it. Gunung Padang in Indonesia, potentially 27,000 years old if the most recent geological surveys are accurate, which would make it older than the last ice age and fundamentally challenge everything we think we know about the development of civilization. Antarctica, with satellite imagery showing geometric formations under the ice that look disturbingly artificial. Are they natural? Probably, but we do not know. And the people who control access to these sites are not in a hurry to find out, because here is the uncomfortable truth. If catastrophic resets happen on cyclical timelines, if advanced societies have risen and fallen multiple times over the past 100,000 years, if the timeline of human development is not a steady upward climb, but a series of peaks and collapses, then everything we teach about history is incomplete. And incomplete histories produce incomplete understandings, and incomplete understandings produce societies that repeat the mistakes of the past because they do not know the past well enough to recognize the pattern. So let me tell you what I think. I think the civilizations we have discussed tonight were not primitive. I think they were us. Different technologies, same vulnerabilities, same confidence that their systems would endure, same belief that collapse was something that happened to other people in other times. And I think we are doing exactly what they did. Building complexity without resilience, trusting institutions that prioritize stability over truth, ignoring warnings because acknowledging them would require changing systems that benefit the people in power. The Maya took centuries to decline. The 5 civilizations we discussed had years, sometimes months, and if the pattern holds, if we are in the early stages of our own collapse, we will not see it coming until it is already here. Because that is how it works. That is how it has always worked. If you have made it this far, if you have spent the last hour and a half going down this rabbit hole with me, then you are already asking the right questions. Keep asking them. Keep digging. Keep questioning the official narratives. Not because they are always wrong, but because they are always incomplete. Subscribe to Tales Before Tesla if you have not already. We are going to keep exploring these hidden histories, these suppressed patterns, these civilizations that vanished before anyone thought to write down why, and leave a comment. Tell me which vanished civilization we should investigate next. Tell me what mysteries you think are being ignored. Tell me if you think mainstream archaeology is hiding evidence or just stuck in outdated paradigms. I want to know what you think, because this is not just history. This is a conversation about what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. And In a world that might be approaching its own threshold, that conversation matters more than ever. The civilizations that vanished overnight were nothing compared to what we could lose. Because we have further to fall,